As the Israel-Hamas conflict nears the 3-month mark, how much longer will the fighting last? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Tensions are high after the assassination of Hamas's deputy leader, Salah AlAruri, that also killed several other Hamas members in Beirut on Tuesday. Israel is being blamed for ordering the fateful drone strike, but we should point out that no one has claimed responsibility for the killing. Isabel Debray of the Associated Press has this report from Jerusalem.
The entire region was on the edge of its seat as Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was set to give his speech a day after the alleged Israeli killing of Salah AlAruri, the Hamas deputy leader, who was also a founder of the military wing in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is Hezbollah's home turf. Hezbollah has previously threatened to respond if such a killing of a Palestinian, Iranian, Lebanese person happens in its own soil. It has threatened to have a harsh response against Israel. And so everyone is really waiting to see what that will be and what it will look like. Hassan Nasrallah, the leader, did not give specific details in his speech, but he did promise revenge. He said that al-Arouri's killing was a dangerous crime that will not go without response and without punishment. But he also made an important point, which is to say that Hezbollah so far has been strategic in its calculus, balancing both support for Gaza, for the Palestinian people, as well as taking into account Lebanese national interests. And this is a balance that we've seen Hezbollah play out in the past few weeks as it has attacked Israel every day on that northern border, is portraying itself as a defender of the Palestinian cause, which is central to its identity as a militant group. But at the same time, it has been careful not to cross any red lines. It's been careful not to elicit a devastating Israeli response, to push it too far. So it has limited its strikes to that northern border area where most of the communities there have been totally evacuated of Israeli civilians, and it has not inflicted massive damage, even though there have been over 100 Hezbollah fighters that have been killed in response. We just have seen this tit-for-tat cross-border exchanges continuing over recent weeks. Today was no exception. And of course, this is to signal that Hezbollah is not only a militant group, it's also an important political power broker in Lebanon, and it is aware that the country itself has little appetite for a devastating war with Israel as it suffers an incredibly deep economic crisis. And Hezbollah, of course, is becoming increasingly unpopular outside of its base of Shiite religious voters, as Lebanese increasingly blame Hezbollah or see it as part of the corrupt political class that has led to the country's financial ruin. And so all of these factors, as well as the regional implications of what would a massive war with Israel look like that could plunge the region into total bloodshed, does play into Hezbollah's calculations in that response. But it was important that Nasrallah also mentioned in his speech that if Israel were to attack Lebanon, if Israel were to make that first move to start a war against Lebanon, he said it will be very, very, very costly. The fighting will have no rules and no ceilings. Isabel Debray with the Associated Press for CGTN in Jerusalem.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Jerusalem, Sara Yael Hirschhorn is a historian and political analyst and a visiting professor at the University of Haifa. In Virginia, Trita Parsi is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. From Oklahoma, we're joined by Joshua Landis. He is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And Khalil Jahshan is the executive director of the Arab Center right here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of you. Khalil Jahshan, as I said, the Israeli onslaught on Gaza is now nearing its 3rd month, and it began after those Hamas attacks in Israel on October 7th. There have been numerous calls from United States officials, cabinet-level officials, the president himself, for Israel to moderate its attacks on Gaza, to moderate the ferocity of the attacks that have seen thousands of people killed, including women and children. What is going on here? Has Israel appeared to just ignore what its main benefactor, the United States, is calling for it to do?
Well, I personally believe that Washington is engaged in kind of a tug-of-war, diplomatic tug-of-war, if you will, with the Israeli government. Even though there is no love lost between the leaders themselves, the administration, President Biden personally, has opted to essentially declare publicly full support for the Israeli government in its right to attack back, to avenge, if you will, in this war on Gaza, the event of October 7, and to oppose a ceasefire, to give Israel, with the understanding between the two, to give Israel the time to achieve its objective. The problem is, there we are, as you said, 3 months almost. The goals have not been achieved, which is destroying Hamas totally, make it totally inoperable militarily, release the hostages, and essentially make sure that Gaza doesn't go back to control by Hamas. None of these is closer to being achieved than we were 3 months ago. So there seems to be a shift in strategy, per advice from the White House, to shift, if you will, the strategy outward, to target maybe Hamas political leadership, who are not necessarily in charge of the war. After all, it was just a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, when the Mossad director was in Doha, negotiating indirectly with Salah AlAruri and his colleagues about the release of hostages, because these are the people you have to talk to, the political Politburo of Hamas, to either reach a ceasefire or release the hostages. So it's kind of contradictory shift in strategy out of necessity, because the goals have failed to be achieved.
Right, Sarah, talking about the goals, Israeli leaders, particularly the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has said one of the goals is to defeat Hamas. But now we're hearing from several Israeli ministers who are now openly talking of removing the Palestinians altogether from Gaza. We heard one minister say we need to resettle Gaza so that the IDF can be protected. What is the ultimate goal of Israel? Is it to claim all of Gaza as its own?
Well, I think we have to take the domestic politics of the current situation into as a factor of what is behind some of the military strategy at this point. I think it's unclear to the general public how much of the goals, stated goals, the Israeli government have reached in terms of, decapitating Hamas leadership, disarming Hamas of rockets and tunnels they have used to attack Israel, and also to protect Israeli southern border communities to ensure that a 10-7 can never happen again. But we are reaching a fork in the road where Benjamin Netanyahu understands very clearly from poll after poll that has been being conducted of the Israeli public that the moment the war is over, or the emergency phase of the war is over, his political tenure is also over. And there are interests by him and his coalition at this point to try to hold the government together. And one way of doing that is to continue to escalate the war in Gaza. And I think some of these incredibly provocative and absolutely unacceptable statements by far-right members of the government also reveal some of their anxieties about what may happen if the Netanyahu-led coalition collapses, because there really is no longer a raison d'etre for keeping this phase of the war going.
Trita, Parsi, how much credibility can we attach to these U.S. calls for Israel to reduce the level of violence that's been inflicted on the Palestinians? Because on the one hand, we hear from, as I said, cabinet-level not ministers, but secretaries, from the Secretary of State, from the Secretary for Defense, from the National Security Advisor, calling on Israel to reduce the level of violence. But on the other hand, we've just seen, again, for the second time, the Secretary of State goes around Congress to supply Israel with more arms, with more bombs.
I think there's been a presumption that perhaps Biden and his administration is not looking at the war exactly the same way as the Israelis are, that it wanted to tone down certain things, perhaps even support a ceasefire if he had the leverage to do so, according to this narrative. I'm quite skeptical of that. I think, on the contrary, the Biden administration is fully on board with the Israeli strategy, and which has been to take out Hamas entirely, at least up until recently. And as a result, has acted more in line with trying to reduce the international damage and pressure from the international community on Israel, rather than really to shift the strategy. At the points in which perhaps there has been a little bit more pressure by the United States to shift the Israeli strategy is not because of necessarily the damage done to the Palestinian people, but the damage that damage to these Palestinian people due to the international backlash against Israel that the administration has tried to minimize and reduce. Moreover, if it really wanted to put pressure on the Israelis, if it truly believed that what Israel was doing was countering the interests of the United States as defined by Biden, then there's plenty of leverage that the United States has, including, as you mentioned, these recent arms transfers. But in total, more than 10,000 tons of weapons and ammunition has been shipped to Israel by the Biden administration since October 10th. The Israelis themselves, the former general was quoted last month as saying that if the Americans stop these shipments, the war will have to end because Israel cannot continue it. So there is leverage. The reason why it hasn't been used is because Biden is not in disagreement with the Israeli strategy.
Just one point on that strategy there, Trita. If we look at what President Biden is saying and what the Americans are doing, I mean, if the goal is to stem the international backlash against Israel, on the one hand, it's costing Biden politically, domestically, isn't it?
Certainly. The coalition, the winning coalition that the Biden team managed to put together in order to win the elections in 2020 is falling apart to a large extent because of Biden's policy on Gaza. It has turned the Gen Z, large parts of the Gen Z against him, and that's a very crucial component of that coalition. The Biden administration does not seem to care. Perhaps their calculation is that 6-7 months from now, other realities will cause those young people to come back to him. I wouldn't be so certain. I think the signs we're seeing is that for a lot of young people in America, this has been a formative event. And as a result, they will not easily forget it.
Joshua Landis, there also appears to be something of a schism between Israeli ministers and the United States president. This is on another issue. It emerged during the decision by the Israeli Supreme Court to stop the reform of the judicial system that President Netanyahu wanted. As I said, it's a separate issue. But if we listen to what some of the ministers have said, it was criticized that Netanyahu's intentions were criticized by President Biden. President Biden said Netanyahu will not be invited to the White House in the near future, and he urged him to drop those plans for reform of the Israeli justice system. But one minister in the cabinet, Israeli minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, he responded by saying that the United States needs to understand Israel is an independent country and not, in his words, another star on the United States flag. At a time like this, when the United States is giving Israel so much aid, financial aid, military aid, that's pretty tough language, isn't it?
It is. This is a watershed moment. I think everybody sees it as a watershed moment, both Palestinians and Israelis. And right-wing Israelis and their supporters are trying to define the two-state solution as anti-Semitism. They're arguing that Palestinians demonstrated on October 7th that they want to kill Israel and destroy Israel and kill Israelis. And therefore, to establish a Palestinian state is an anti-Semitic move. And that Biden and other Democrats have become essentially supporters of this anti-Semitism. Now, Palestinians are opposing this narrative, and they're saying, no, we're being oppressed. We've been denied by Israel our self-determination, justice, and so forth. We have to go down swinging. We cannot allow ourselves to be pushed out of Palestine without fighting. And so those two narratives are extremely important. Gvir, in doing this, is trying to move Israel to the right. He sees this as a big opportunity to move Israelis to the right, to establish the fact that there cannot be a two-state solution. Biden has said that the status quo we cannot return to the status quo, and that we need a two-state solution. They're trying, Gvir and Netanyahu are trying to put paid to that two-state solution. And Americans are confused. I think the Democratic Party is very confused. Biden, as we've heard, is glued to Israel. He is not going to separate himself from Israel. So his administration is really, I think, torn and in a state of complete confusion about whether they're going to support two states or whether they're not going to support two states.
Sarah, very briefly, that view in Israel that any calls for a two-state solution is actually anti-Semitic. That's how it's being framed by the right in Israel. How prevalent is it across the country?
I think that, again, this reflects a lot of the anxieties of the current coalition of where they and their policy agenda will be down the road in really a very short period of time. Every poll that we've seen of expectations of Israelis, should they go to elections in the near future, represents an interest in a very broad-based centrist coalition, probably run by Prime Minister Benny Gantz, who's currently a member of the Emergency War Coalition, and the leader of one of the centrist parties in Israel. And I think that these parties would likely not be represented in a new government. I don't see any intention by a centrist coalition to include those members of the government when they have other parties to choose from to get to that magic number of 61 seats in the Knesset. So I think they now realize that, the days are short for their policy goals, and they are yelling as loud as possible about what they would like to see as their vision for the future in order to get out the most right-wing Israeli, voters to the polls and to get those attitudes represented. But I don't think that they broadly represent the attitudes of Israelis who I think since 10/7 have been rethinking the meaning of a two-state solution with Hamas in control of Gaza, and perhaps with Hezbollah threatening Israeli communities in the north. So the kind of two-state solution that we may have been looking at in the past looks somewhat different. But I think Israelis understand that they live in a dangerous neighborhood, and the only way to really succeed is through a diplomatic solution.
Okay. Khalil, Jahshan, Israel's main backers, we look at the United States, Canada, the European Union, at this stage they appear to be exerting very little pressure on Israel to enter into negotiations to try and end the violence. But now there's been a development. South Africa has filed a case of genocide against Israel. The hearing will start next week. We're expecting a finding shortly thereafter. I mean, how does this action by South Africa change things?
It does to a certain degree, but I'm not sure whether it will genuinely and in a deep way change the attitude of these countries that you mentioned. There is no doubt about it that the attitude in the West, particularly here in the United States, and the others tend to follow, frankly. I don't think Europe leads an independent policy vis-a-vis Israel, unfortunately. Usually it has much better position than the U.S., but it seems to kind of surrender, if you will, control over this Western policy to the U.S., let the U.S. lead in this regard. The same thing applies to Canada. So what you have here is an attempt by these countries out of guilt, call it whatever you want. They tend to give Israel total freedom to engage in a war of this magnitude.
Yeah, Khalil, if I could just interrupt you there. If there is a finding of genocide by the court, my understanding that all 153 members of the convention, which includes Israel and the United States, are then legally obliged to stop that genocide.
Precisely, it would change the rules of the game, and that's why the U.S. is panicky, and these countries are panicking and rushing to help Israel in spite of itself. But they do not see the fact that they have contributed to this state of affairs by giving the green light to Israel to proceed and to bash heads and not to be accountable. So you can't pretend when you look at the green light given by Mr. Biden to Netanyahu, his refusal to accept a ceasefire, even a humanitarian one, and that Netanyahu, according to Biden and the White House, needs to finish the job, whatever that finish the job means. He can't pretend to be a bystander now and come quickly to try to block the international community from taking action, surprising action that he did not anticipate.
Trita, there's been two other big developments. We talked about one of them. A senior Hamas leader was assassinated in Beirut. No one has claimed responsibility for the killing of Salah AlAruri. The other development is a series of explosions at the tomb of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani on the 4th anniversary of his assassination by the United States. How much do these two events bring us closer to a regional conflict? Hamas, at least Hezbollah, has already said that, was already threatened a, quote, no-holds-barred war if this continues.
I mean, ever since October 7th, and as the war has progressed, and there has been these consecutive efforts by the Biden administration to block a ceasefire, has step-by-step brought us closer to a regional war. And these latest attacks, when we have an assassination of an Iranian general in Damascus, assassination of the Hamas leader in Beirut, now an explosion or two explosions that killed more than 100 people in Iran. We don't know if it is connected or not, but if it is, it certainly seems to then portray a pattern in which there is an effort to escalate this war and widen it. And it's been quite clear from the Israeli side that expanding it into Lebanon, at least, is something that the Israelis thought about early on. The Biden administration credits itself for having prevented that, but now we're seeing more attacks, and it's not clear that the Israelis are listening to the U.S. any longer on that score. But if there is also an effort to bring Iran into it, and we had an op-ed by Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, about 5 days ago in the Wall Street Journal, calling for a U.S.-Israeli effort to take on Iran. And we should not forget that there's been an effort, particularly by the Netanyahu government, for the last 20 years to bring the United States into war directly with Iran. It's been rebuffed by several U.S. administrations, but they may now have found the most deferential administration in recent memory, and as a result may see an opportunity to expand it in that direction. This would be absolutely devastating for the region as a whole, but also for the United States. And it's, again, a bit mysterious as to why the Biden administration is not pushing back much, much harder against this if it does not want to see an escalation of the war.
Joshua Landis, Western media are describing the assassination of Salah AlAruri as a significant blow for Hamas. And we know, as Khalil pointed out earlier to us, that Hamas has two parts. I mean, there's the political wing and there's the military arm of the organization. So does the assassination actually impact the war effort, its war effort, in a major way? And what does this assassination do for the prospects of Israeli hostages being released?
It's going to harden both sides. I think there's quite a bit of work that demonstrates scholarship that demonstrates that by assassinating top leaders, often terrorist organizations or other militant organizations are radicalized, because younger people rise up into those positions and they have to show that they're capable, that they're tough, and that they're going to get revenge. Right. This is only going to polarize both sides. And we saw the relatives of Arouri, his sister, his mother, come out and make very emotional statements on YouTube saying that there are going to be 1,000 Arouris that are going to replace him, that they're going to get revenge, and that this war is ongoing. And I think it riles up passions on both sides.
I want to move on to the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but before I do that, Sara, very briefly, if you could please, how concerned is Israel about this court action, the South African court action?
I think that Israel takes this case seriously. They have said that they will represent themselves when this hearing goes forward. So they, will not, merely bypass the process or appear in absentia. They seem to be taking it seriously, and there's rumors, floating around the internet about who they might hire as part of a legal team. Yeah. But I don't think that Israel is particularly concerned in general with, South Africa's opinion about the war, about, how some other countries that are really not in the region are using this as a, distraction or a representation of their own ideology. I think Israel will take the legal process seriously, but I think they're more concerned with what's happening on the ground.
Okay. Khalil, Jahshan, talking about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, when you look at the situation right now, according to figures from the Gaza Ministry of Health, 22,300 Palestinians have been killed, 70% women and children, 57,000 injured. There are no hospitals, as we know, that are fully functional in the territory. The United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution just not so long ago, which called for the unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza. What do you know of that?
Well, frankly, we've been hearing a lot of semantics about this humanitarian situation. There seems to be a consensus. Everybody, including even Israel, talks about the seriousness of the humanitarian situation, although you hear some crazy voices even within the cabinet in Israel saying, let them starve. That's the only way we can control them, including in the Knesset, different voices arguing crazy ideas, very extreme ideas like that sound Nazi to me. But at any rate, in spite of all the good intentions, the U.S. trying so much, every time we sit and talk to somebody in the administration, they talk about the effort by Satterfield and others, the Secretary of State, trying to work out all the difficulties that hindered the supply of humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, but it hasn't reached the necessary level according to professional humanitarian organizations who know what they are talking about. We keep talking about maybe 40, 50, 100 trucks a day when you need about 400, 500, 600 trucks a day to catch up and meet the needs.
Right. Trita, very quickly, I've got less than a minute left. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he will be back in the region next week. That visit was scheduled for this week, but it's been postponed. There's already a bipartisan United States Senate delegation, the Senate Intelligence Committee, that's in Israel right now. Do you expect anything to come out of this?
I don't expect any major change in the Biden administration's official until there is a realization that the cost of this policy to the U.S., to the Biden administration itself, is simply unbearable. And there are plenty of elements inside the administration that already thinks that point was passed weeks ago, and we know a lot of dissent and unhappiness inside the administration. But within the White House, within the close circle around Biden, that sentiment has not yet emerged. But it's not until then that we will see a shift, and I don't think that's going to come within the next week or so. It's probably going to take at least a month or two.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.